everyone, and welcome to the Creative Confidence Podcast. I'm your host, Mina Seetharaman. 2/3 of leaders say they would rather be seen as decisive and get the decision wrong than appear uncertain and get it right. It may sound illogical, but it's actually the result of decades of organizational culture, training leaders that decisiveness equals strength and that not knowing is a liability. My guest today calls this the decisiveness crisis, and he has the data to back it up. I'm joined today by Sam Conniff, founder of the Uncertainty Experts, author of the Uncertainty Toolkit, and the person behind the book Be More Pirate, a global movement on professional rule breaking. Sam came to this research through a personal crisis that the leadership books couldn't touch, and he built what is now one of the world's largest workplace studies on uncertainty with his neuroscientist partner, Catherine Templer-Lewis. In this conversation, we get into the most striking findings from that research, the 3 ways uncertainty shows up in your body before it ever reaches the boardroom, and 3 questions that help leaders make better decisions without pretending they have answers they don't have. This is the second episode in our series on uncertainty. The first was with Simone Stolzoff on the emotional and philosophical side of not knowing. Sam brings the data. Subscribe so you don't miss the conversations ahead. If you want to keep building this kind of thinking, explore IDOU's courses in leadership and innovation at idou.com. Now, here's my conversation with Sam Conniff. So why don't we start at the beginning, actually? You've been studying uncertainty for quite some time. What drew you to the topic?
Personal reason. I fell into a volume of uncertainty that I found incredibly difficult. And for the years prior to that, my interest has always been leadership. I ran social enterprises for many years. I worked in the edges of society, a big believer that innovation happens in the edges. I worked with disproportionately less advantaged communities around the world, whether it's townships in South Africa or kind of inner city South London, and really observed the benefits of coming to leadership with a different lens. I wrote a book all about challenging the rules and what's something I call professional rule breaking, based on the true history of 17th century pirates, which very few people know, the role that they had as social revolutionaries and forerunners of many of the privileges that we share, actually, on the long history of the English working class and fights for civil rights around the world. And just at the kind of pinnacle of my career, when I was an award-winning entrepreneur and a best-selling author and an advocate of change, the volume of change that hit me sent me spiraling into a kind of uncertainty that I didn't know how to deal with. And it was all the difficult things of depression and debt and divorce, all in midlife with small kids and a massively fragile ego. And I couldn't find the answers in the classic paradigms of leadership that were in front of me. And every single book you can have on the topic of leadership was in front of me. And I've done the TED Talks and been in all the places that I'm sure many of us listening have been and seen. And there wasn't anything that answered the problem I felt, the panic and the overwhelm and the sense of identity loss. And I began drawing some of these threads together. And I started looking at people whose lived experience was on the edges of society, be it that they had kind of had their schooling in gangs, or perhaps they had survived the experience of being a refugee, or maybe it had been even more personal. Perhaps it was substance misuse or even homelessness. And yet now they were successes in inverted commas that we would recognize, i.e. they were CEOs or they'd risen to the top of their game, whatever framework that society would validate as a success. And so they had a duality to them. And I began interviewing them. And there was also a methodology to them. And what I found was a very consistent set of threads in their stories that had allowed them to navigate the shadows of uncertainty and were concurrent in their success as leading lights. And before I ran into stories of survivor bias, which I don't think is what anybody needs in this moment of great uncertainty, I found a specialist laboratory looking specifically at leadership and decision-making uncertainty. And so I got the lab to verify what I thought I'd seen as trends, and actually what they were able to diagnose was neurological capabilities, effectively. And then in partnership with Catherine, we began to create the toolbook. And that's what the Uncertainty Experts is. It's based on stories of remarkable characters whose lived experience prepared them for a world that many of us are struggling with, that are based on a series of very robust science-based tools that can help anybody increase their tolerance to uncertainty.
Okay. We're going to talk about all of that. There's so much to unpack just in that little intro. But before we do that, our audience loves a good warm up. And so we're going to do one of those. You have one from your book that I'd like to try. It's a quick exercise in the book. It probably makes a point in a really unexpected way, but a better way than maybe any explanation could. So it's called the Q test. So take us through it.
Okay. So I mentioned 2 words there, and there's going to be a lot of words. There's going to be a high word count for this podcast, I'm sure, between the 2 of us. But if there are 2 words that you hopefully leave with at the end of it, let them be uncertainty tolerance, because no matter who or how you speak to or hear from in this series, the truth is there's nothing you can do about uncertainty, and nor should we, really. The problem isn't uncertainty, the problem that we're trying to fix anyway. And you can't change uncertainty, but what you can change is your relationship to uncertainty. And that's what we've proven, and we can show people how to do, and it's easier than you think. And the pathway into that is a psychological trait known as uncertainty tolerance. It was discovered in the 1990s by Canadian researchers. And it sits in the lower regions of our brain. So not the prefrontal cortex, where all of the smart people tend to think they can think their way through uncertainty. And sadly, that's not possible. Or you can think your way partially through uncertainty. But to be able to really navigate it, we need to access something that is deeper within us. And so this exercise will identify where uncertainty tolerance sits, because it's a cousin of bias and prejudice, and those things sit further back, more towards the amygdala, the primal regions of your brain. So to give you a sense of where you can get your hands on this lesser-known trait that we all share, if you would please be so kind as you listen to this to take your finger to your forehead. So whether you're on a subway or in a park or walking down a street or driving your car, perhaps if you're driving your car, don't do this unless you're in a driverless car, depending on where you are. If you're safe, and it feels so comfortable to do so, please put one of your fingers on your forehead. And now, if you'd be so kind as to draw a capital letter Q on your forehead using your finger. Draw a Q, you all know what it's like. It's a circle with a small tail on it. And that's great. If you've done it, now you can put your hands down. And now I'd like to know which way you drew the tail of the Q. I was asking you to draw it whilst talking over you, so you had to get in touch with an unconscious thought process while still trying to work out what I was saying. Mina, did you draw the Q to your left eye or your right eye?
To my left eye, because I imagine somebody else looking at the Q.
So everybody who drew the Q to their left eye, please put their hand up.
My hand's up. That's why I'm laughing.
And you and listening. Thousands of people around the world right now walking through their parks and sitting in their offices with their hands in the air. And all of you who've shared this, put your hands up for the left eye. You all, and there's probably from my experience, about 25% of the people listening would have done this. And you, just like Mina said, drew the Q for the benefit of the person looking at you. And in the 2 separate studies around this particular point, it was shown that you guys make better liars. Because your default was to think about the way someone was going to look at you, and their story related to you. And the 75% who are listening are now laughing. Before you get too smug, my friends, the same studies showed that you guys had lower rates of empathy. You drew the Q for yourself. Your automatic reflex was to draw a Q that you could read left to right across your eyes. You weren't thinking about me or anybody else looking at you. Now, Catherine, my neuroscience partner in this, she doesn't love this piece of research. She is a more hardcore scientist than I am. And it's a little bit of a parlor game, as you can tell. But it's fun. And what it does is it tells us where this sits. I love this fact. Human beings have 362 biases, which is nearly one for every single day of the year. You get 3 days off. Yeah, imagine 3 days off from any bias.
That feels like a book in and of itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, like one of those, a poem for every day, a bias. And so right back there, and the reason that it's interesting, it doesn't matter a fig which way you drew a Q next week, because there aren't many Qs in the news, and there aren't many Qs that are going to cause you much pain. But next week, there will be uncertainty in your life. Something will happen that you weren't expecting. And it might be the budget changes, or your team changes, or someone doesn't show up for work, or someone does show up at your door. Whatever it is, something's going to happen that you're not prepared for. And the way that you respond, your uncertainty tolerance that sits back in that same part of the brain, will have that effect. And whether it goes left or right, or up and down, or is protective or aggressive, that is what's going to matter. And because uncertainty tolerance is what's known in medical science as a transdiagnostic, which we'll come back to, it affects pretty much everything. And so how you respond and how high or low your uncertainty tolerance is, in exactly the same way you went left or right without hopefully thinking about it too much, the impact of that subconscious response is huge. So we use it as an exercise just to demonstrate that we all have a preference, as we do in most things. And that's where uncertainty tolerance sits. And that's why it's so important, because everyone listening and everyone that you care about, everyone that you're listening, has an uncertainty tolerance. And if it is low, it is a limiting factor. And if it is high, it is a liberating factor. And we have tools that will enable not just you, but you to be able to share them with others so that we can all take a lift in our tolerance to uncertainty and our navigation of the unknown.
Excellent. Okay, so you had said something in that when you were describing the exercise to us that I thought was interesting, that you talked about trying to fix uncertainty, that you can't do it. And you've referred to it in the book as a false brief. Can we unpack that a little bit? Because I do think you're right. I think that is the instinct that the majority of people, a challenging situation with. It's a really human desire. We seem a little bit wired to look for the comfort of certainty. But why do you feel that is actually the wrong goal?
Well, we should start by saying who we is. I think it is a very Western outlook. I think it's a very cognitive outlook. I think it's a very, I think the curse of the clever is often they tend to make things more complicated. I don't like what I'm going through, but let's have a strategy review.
We like the illusion of control a lot, actually. Yeah.
Yes, that is precisely what it is. In moments of uncertainty, it is human nature to reach for what psychologically are known as safety behaviors. So for some, that's a glass of wine. For others, it's a snack. For others, it's doom scrolling. It's a short-term fix that alleviates the sense of dysregulation. And if you're at work and something's happening you don't know, it's very easily, let's organize a meeting. If you're nervous about the email you're sending, let's just CC a few more people on this.
But anyway,
the top 5 uncertainty safety behaviors at work are calling meetings, false busyness, seeking advice in others, strategy reviews, CCing people. I mean, it is a real product. I think that Adobe did the report on uncertainty and productivity. It is a huge driver of it because, yes, absolutely, we would far prefer. And also, it's not a criticism. It is natural for us to want to do the things that we are good at when we're lost. Let's default to the stuff that we know how to do. That is a good instinct. What we're asking for is not to criticize that, but it's to raise the awareness. Am I doing this because it's a safety behavior to make me feel better in the moment? The key thing here, to stop this sounding like blame, is that uncertainty typically registers in the body as a threat. And this is the first and most fundamental part of our work and why it differs from the majority. Actually, I say that and I haven't listened to all your other guests. I might, in 7 podcasts from now, I might be wrong. And we're all saying the same thing. But uncertainty traditionally is often overlaps with risk. And so we tend to approach it with theoretical frameworks. And rightly so. Very often a good, acronym or a 3-point triangle, that can get you quite far. But whilst uncertainty does have a complex aspect to it, it has an emotional and felt aspect to it because of this sense that it registers in the body as a threat. So if you can think your way partially through it, you also need to be able to feel your way through it just as deeply as we feel the instance of uncertainty, because it's the feeling of uncertainty that takes our prefrontal cortex and our cognitive and analytical abilities offline, and thus it feels like a panic and we find ourselves reaching for safety behaviors because they will quell the emotional side of it.
So really the leaders who are probably best at handling or tolerating uncertainty aren't the ones who try to eliminate it, right? They're the ones who recognize those feelings in their body and learn how to navigate them or operate even though they've sensed those feelings.
Yeah. And again, I try not to say good or bad at uncertainty because, it is, all we're really trying to get to is we need to have a balanced understanding of uncertainty. There are many uncertainties that will take place and they'll be bloody awful. And then there are many uncertainties that are wonderful and were liberating. And if you and I were to have a conversation, if we could suddenly access every single person who listens to this and we said to them all, tell us the 3 career defining moments of your life. What put you on the map? What got you where you are? And what are the factors around that? I would bet my house that 99% of them had an aspect of uncertainty or risk or probability. And it was the listener standing up against the odds and, they had to weigh it all up. I bet very, very few of them were, well, I expected this thing to happen. And over 3 years, very gradually, the exact, it's not the relation with our greatest work and our career defining moments and uncertainty is something that we tend to overlook. And the statistic here, and please feel free to try this if you want to. The quickest way to benchmark or test our work is to ask your team or anyone that you care about, what they think about uncertainty. And I predict they'll give you a balanced and analytical response. In short, it's a third good, a third bad, and a third mixed. That's roughly how the data shows up. And depending on the team that we're talking to, that can vary, but it's broadly balanced. And then ask how uncertainty makes them feel. And over 5 years, tens of thousands of data points tell me that broadly your response will now be 80% negative, 10% positive, and 10% mixed. And that differential is where our work fills the gap. Here's the coming uncertainty. Here's our 2-year plan as we're all going to step into the unknown. Here's the new technology that you've never used before. And here is the new audience that we don't have any understanding of. Okay.
Right.
We've got a great plan. We love the OKRs. We've signed off on the vision statement. Theoretically, this is all sounding good. But tomorrow I'm doing something that I don't know what to do, and that does not feel good. So the difference between the thought response and the felt response, and if one is balanced and one is overwhelmingly negative, now you understand why Roger in accounts is blowing up and the other guys haven't shown up, and everyone's reaching for another meeting and all those safety behaviors show up, because it's the felt response, and that difference makes the difference.
It's really interesting to me too, because if I think about a lot of corporate life, we sort of train people out of having emotional responses to things. And I think that as a result, they're ill-equipped to handle those responses. So that's why people blow up at other people or freak out in a moment. Some of those things are totally human, but because in the corporate environment, especially in the Western world, we pretend like not having an emotional response is the right way of handling things. And so you train yourself out of really recognizing those responses in your body, I've found. Whereas I've actually spent a lot of time trying to understand why I'm having certain responses to things so that I can deal with them in the moment and not make them sort of impact how I'm speaking to somebody or how I'm treating somebody. I think about it more from a mindful leadership perspective. But it's sort of an interesting idea, this notion of actually paying attention to this idea of uncertainty being processed like a threat in your body and how you can kind of handle that.
Yeah, and yes, but I'd like to challenge that a bit.
Sure.
Because I want to sidestep the notion that this is an emotional response because of the exact problem that you just diagnosed. There are huge swathes of industry which recognize the need for emotional intelligence, and there are others that might not be so, and I'm going to fall into the same trap. It's so littered with archetypes, right? I was going to say
Right.
enlightened, and I don't actually mean that. Our work is built on neuroscience. Catherine leads it. Neuroscience truly means nervous system. It's not just brain. And it's that whole...
Actually, fair point. That's excellent. Yeah, it's an excellent distinction. Yeah.
So yes, there is an emotional aspect as well as there's a cognitive aspect, but it's truly the human response to uncertainty.
Yeah.
And what our work does is shines a light of truth and honesty, because your team are responding to uncertainty in a dualistic approach. Now, if you're not aware of that or able to be honest about it, then we'll run into a challenge. So we are enabling a fully honest and robust response. And the reason I want to be clear about it is because otherwise there'll be aspects of work who think I'm saying you should bring your whole self to work, which I believe in wholeheartedly, but immediately that comes with a set of trappings of its own. The challenge and the danger, and why I want to be clear about it, is because in my experience, the people who need this most are the people who can ask for it least. Let me give you another, the follow-on framework from this question about how do you think about uncertainty, broadly analytical, how does uncertainty make you feel? In the first year of research, we had over 3,000 responses to that question. And the felt responses fell very quickly into 3 categories, which have never been broken. The first and largest, still to this day, is uncertainty makes me anxious, sleepless, a bit worried, concerned, scared. We call that fear. Now, that's a very difficult thing for most people to admit or articulate in the workplace. And it's not per se the emotion that is difficult. It's the workplace culture where there isn't a social contract that enables us to tell the truth about a feeling that we are universally having. And that's the problem itself, not the feeling.
Yes, fair. Yeah.
And then secondly is uncertainty makes me a bit circular, slightly confused, a bit frustrated, like I'm going around and around, a bit mentally foggy. And that's because of a thing called cognitive dissonance. So the first one is explained because uncertainty shows up in the body, in the nervous system as a threat. And the second is uncertainty creates cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is about prediction error. The brain expects something to happen. If it goes right, you get one chemical, well done. And if it goes wrong, Pavlov's dogs, that doesn't feel nice. I'll avoid that mistake again. Prediction error doesn't, it's not a great experience. And when it happens repeatedly in a very uncertain world, we begin mentally to shut down, make less predictions. We're going to be safe. And the third is uncertainty just makes me feel a bit stuck, a bit lost, a bit like I've lost my mojo, and this is the furthest end of it. And we call that stasis. Fear, fog, and stasis I offer to everybody listening as the framework for the true underbelly of uncertainty. If people are having a tough time with uncertainty, they'll be experiencing one or more of fear, fog, and stasis. And if they're experiencing all three, they're in trouble. But the more you're experiencing them all, the less able or likely you are to articulate that need because you feel anxious, you're not thinking clearly, and you feel stuck. So there is a counterintuitive aspect to this work, which is why try to be really clear that everyone is experiencing uncertainty. Everyone is connected to those difficult subsets. And the more we elevate that and demonstrate and understand that uncertainty tolerance, if it's low, we're having these responses, then we start to get honest about it and we unlock the other sides of it. Because that's where the work gets really interesting. Because just as there's these negative aspects, the flip is where it gets really not just productive, not just powerful, but I think offers, and I mean this and I can evidence it, I think it offers the paradigm for the shift in leadership that we're all looking for to help answer some of the questions that feel unanswerable and have done for many years. And as the overall framework and the horizon begins to reveal itself, uncertainty tolerance is a very substantial foundation for which a new paradigm of leadership can be built.
We've been talking about the research, and I want to dig in a little bit more here because I think it's one of the things that sets your and Catherine's work apart from a lot of folks who have written books and articles on this. A lot of that is narrative, a lot of that is anecdotal. It's not that your work contains none of that, but I also think the research pieces really create a lovely underpinning to help us frame out the kind of evidence behind a lot of what you talk about. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you were measuring actually when you were thinking about uncertainty tolerance, and how did you measure improvement in that scale?
So yes, absolutely. We have a very robust data set. We have got 20,378 confirmed participants. We have it for 2020 all the way through to this year. We have it from 3 different sources. We have the readers of our book, which we've been recording since January. We have a digital course that we co-produced with Netflix. We have what we call the State of Uncertainty Survey, which is always anonymous and begins before any engagement. And it's 10 questions, of which we have some canonical questions now over 6 years, asking repeatedly, what's the main uncertainty you face? How does it make you feel? What do you think of about it? What's the opportunity in that uncertainty? What's going to get in your way? Then we have the quantitative. So before the intervention and after the intervention, we measure the intolerance of uncertainty scale. We measure what's known as the need for closure scale, which is a really interesting attitudinal score that has a preference measure. Oh, it has a discomfort with ambiguity question. I mean, how long have we been saying we've got to get comfortable with the uncomfortable? We measure it. Closed-mindedness, need for order and structure. We measure a risk scale. We measure a self-efficacy score, which I think is the really important one. Your ability to navigate into the unknown and believe in yourself to get there. And then during the intervention, whether it's in person or online, we record a series of qualitative reflections. And this is partly why the program is so powerful. There's three parts as we understand it, and it's been pulled apart by academics and put back together. The first is that we tell these remarkable stories. I'm now learning about imposter syndrome from a guy who was a smuggler. I'm now learning about navigating fear and emotional regulation from an ex-gang leader. Oh, look, and now I'm learning about conviction narrative theory from an ex-Buddhist monk. Like there's a remarkable set of characters. And then you meet the scientists led by Catherine. And so after that stimulation, you get this really clear amount of information. And then people are led through a series of reflections. And those reflections, they're anonymized. They give us the really robust qualitative corpus of work. So we understand what people have said their greatest fears are, the greatest adversities that they're proudest to have overcome. And again, thoughts on the uncertainties that they face. So it's a robust data set. And I can tell you that, for instance, the sector that we have taken that has the biggest increase in scores is professional services, followed by media and technology. I can tell you that the smallest increases that we've had across anyone is healthcare, but that's because, and healthcare and sport. And that's because they start with the highest uncertainty tolerance. If you work in healthcare and you work in sport, you're very good at this already. And the biggest jumps we see are always in the groups who have the lowest scores to begin with. I can tell you that the worst rates of uncertainty tolerance amongst any demographic are in young people under 24. And that biologically shouldn't be the case. On an evolutionary basis, they should be great at it.
That's really interesting.
So the positive drivers of uncertainty tolerance is strategic decision-making, creative problem-solving, empathy, because literally you can correspond with people you don't agree with, And the negatives will be anxiety, groupthink, rush decision making. So you can add a 30% increase to a 15% decrease in the positives and minuses. It's a huge impact.
Wow. That's so interesting. I'm not surprised at the healthcare that they have such high uncertainty tolerance. My mom used to be an ER nurse. I just felt like that whole job was who knows what's showing up today, and you just sort of had to be ready for it. But didn't know if you'd noticed any changes in that over time, or in any of the industries actually over time, given the changes in the macro environment for them.
So when we ask what's the number one uncertainty, have a guess, right? The number one uncertainty, what's the main uncertainty you face? 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, and 26, the same thing has been said, and it comes out consistently as the main uncertainty, and it's always around 60% of responses.
Every year since, I mean, I think of those years and I'm not sure I could guess, like maybe jobs, economy. I'm not positive.
Absolutely.
Really? Okay.
Career, 57%, 48%, 62%, and then relationships. And then the one that shifts is that in 2021, 22, it was home and life. And then 23, 24, it became parenting. Then 25, it became global conflict, the first time that ever showed up. 26 is the first time AI showed up.
Of course, yeah.
Of course. And this year is the first time we've ever seen the questions of identity and personal meaning. Because in that next question, what's the big opportunity uncertainty? To begin with, it was always growth progression. Then it was about stability and money. And this year, for the first time ever, to the tune that's gone into the top 3, people have started talking about selfhood and identity. And I don't think we saw at the beginning of this that uncertainty is very much an identity question.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that actually, because I do think there is an identity component to this, and I found that really fascinating. But you have a very, I'll call it provocative finding. You think of it as the cost of decisiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And you've hosted uncertainty tolerance sessions with many large organizations, big names we would all recognize. There's a question that you ask in every leadership session. I'd love for you to share with us what that is and what you learned from that question.
Yes, and thank you for bringing it up. It's my favorite. I think it explains everything. We're in the UK right now in the midst of a parliamentary crisis, and so it very much explains our leadership. Possibly yours, possibly anybody's listening.
Yeah.
And the question is this, and pause for a moment, unless of course you're driving. But by now you've pulled over anyway. And answer this question anonymously, because we ask this anonymously. So in a moment of profound uncertainty, would you prefer to be seen as decisive, even if you knew that would lead to a negative outcome? So a rush decision, moving before you're ready, whatever it might be. Or could you tolerate being seen as indecisive if in time a positive outcome would emerge? And just consider the environment, consider your position, consider how it feels to be seen as decisive or indecisive. Consider the cost that might be to you or the emotions associated with it, and be very, very honest. Which do you think you'd go for in a moment of profound uncertainty? Now, the question was written for us by Dr. Avery Bilovich, who heads up research at the Decision Making and Uncertainty Centre at London's University College London, who've been our partners in this throughout the duration. And they were established in 2009 in the wake of the financial collapse to look specifically at the role of uncertainty as a subset of complexity science and how they could help organizations make better decisions amongst the unknown. And we're very proud of our association with them. And he helped me frame the question. And the interesting thing is, you're given a straight choice, binary, positive outcome, negative outcome.
Mm-hmm.
There should be no choice.
Right. Yeah.
I should be looking at a data sheet which is very boring and it says 100% of people would choose a positive outcome. Not the case. Consistently, if you take the aggregate data, and we are talking in the absolute thousands, the clean data point is 3,159 leaders. But it concludes about 7,000 in total. Two-thirds do say negative outcome.
Wow.
With continuous consistency over a 4-year period in all sectors, all geographies. We're consistently asked if surely this would be different in Turkey or Nigeria. Nope.
No.
Wherever you go, 2/3. And now we can get into the variance, because I can tell you how that splits between the wider team, C-suite, etc. Because there's a real warning shot in here. Again and again, given the options, that is the outcome.
That's so fascinating to me. So, full disclosure for the audience, I've taken the online course. And so this was an interesting question for me because I thought at first I was like, oh, I like to look decisive. And then I thought about the last 10 decisions I had made, and they were all in the latter bucket, which was like, I don't know that I have this right. I'm going to just take a beat and contemplate this just a little bit more, like 5 more minutes. A day more will not make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but do I know that I will have the right answer? I don't know that I will have the right answer, but I'm pretty sure I would have a better answer. And so it really helped me to contemplate what was more important to me. And just that idea of like, sometimes I just don't know, and that's okay. And you can kind of embrace that and be comfortable with that. And I love that it's actually, the data is so consistent across geographies and industries. You sort of briefly mentioned that there are differences at different levels. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So when we first asked the question, we weren't asking demographics, and I was just fascinated by this. And I'd get on stage and I'd be like, look, here's the answer. Like this is it. This explains business and politics. This explains the mess we're in. This explains, why capitalism is working. Like, pick a problem. This explains it. And 2/3 of the room would look back at me like I'm an idiot. They'd be like, of course. And I was like, oh, right. Yeah, of course. Most of you agree. Uh-oh. But, if you're really decisive, you haven't even listened to the end of the question. It's not about positive and negative outcome. It's about being decisive. I don't need the end of your question. And so it's taken me a while to really think about this. So we ask it in firms at leadership level. We ask it in billion-dollar businesses who are, going through this huge escalation. And so we really started to look at it and capture demographics. And once or twice, it's been gender. And, some people who identify as female said it's more, they have to show decisiveness to amongst their peers. Other men have said they don't feel they can be vulnerable and show indecision. But it wasn't consistent, and it wasn't enormous. Geographies, we were sure, wasn't consistent. It wasn't enormous. The true defining factor isn't in the demographics that you'd expect it to be. So we can come back to what it is, where the difference in this lies. But to answer your question about hierarchy, yes, that is the only statistically measurable difference, but it's not the main one. But as I'm looking at the data in front of me here, so C-suite executives will choose decisive negative outcome to the tune of, on average, 52%. So that's at least where it kind of starts to get healthy-ish. If you take a C-suite executive in one of the industries, so it really varies. Energy is extremely high with a preference towards being decisive. Finance services, also extremely high decisive. You can kind of make sense. Professional services, extremely high. You get down to NGOs, defense, it begins to vary. Technology is much better at being able to handle this. Health, of course, life and death. So the best team we've ever seen, health and defense, C-suite, goes down to 40%. That's still 40% that would say, have a negative outcome, please. And we work in life and death matters. So if you go back into one of the industries where it's high, energy, and you go now into the teams, so the individual contributors or team members, that's about 55%. And that makes sense. Makes sense, both these. The C-suite, they've been there long enough, they've seen enough of these things. We're not so high on the negative outcome preference. The team, well, they're the ones who'll have to tidy up the mess. So where it goes off the scale is SLT, senior leadership teams. Then, depending on the sector, in a high preference sector like energy, it goes up to 82%. Financial services, 79%. You can really see this shift. And when we've dug into this, this is said without any shade or criticism whatsoever. It is said with absolute compassion for a vulnerable layer in most businesses. And because if you look at the tenure, if it's SLT under 3 years, that's when it's 80% and upwards. So this is your 40s probably. So it's children entering towards adulthood, parents entering a certain age and life stage. You've arrived in a job that you've probably spent 20 years trying to work your way towards. That job has fundamentally shifted in the last 3 years. Your work-life situation has got a permeability that you haven't ever caught up with and isn't coming back. The technology that you're meant to use is something that didn't exist when you grew up and is akin to the power of gods, and you're actually meant to be on top of it. The geography, everything has changed. Your payroll hasn't changed, but the value of it has certainly changed, and not in a good direction. And you're trying to reconcile all of that. And you're in control of the budget. You still want the top job, even though it doesn't look as good as it used to. And the world seems to be falling apart. And you've certainly got enough lifespan to have to look after your kids in it. compounded pressure and the crosshair that you're within, and the fact that you know there is no time to catch. You don't even have an opinion on most of this stuff. So does it feel like you have to show up and know what you're doing? Yeah, because also most of your career being strong and decisive was the playbook. If you've done an INSEAD MBA, that's absolutely what you learn. Indecision kills businesses. So here we are, not knowing. And does not saying you don't know feel safe? Hell no. And do you think your team want to hear? I don't know. Hell no. And do your investors want to hear? I don't know. Does your board want to hear? I don't know. Hell no. So I say it with compassion to those teams, SLT. I say it with deep love and compassion. I've seen hundreds of you over the last couple of years, and I recognize how hard it is. And for anybody else, I say it because we need to shine a light on that group and provide a specialist level of support, because you can see the vulnerability. If many of our organizations, particularly in high risk industries, optimizing for negative outcomes to protect the people around them in a default response to uncertainty, which is at a nervous system level, we do not have a good few years ahead. And it is not to say that there are not times when a decisive need is very, very clear, and continued indecision is very, very dangerous. But this is why I said earlier on that I think there is a paradigm shift that we're going through in a world where it's impossible to know what to do all the time. I mean, no one listening to this podcast can stay up with the newsletters that they subscribe to about AI, let alone the AI itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're still supposed to show up in an all-hands meeting and have the answers. Come on.
I like how you refer to this actually as the decisiveness crisis, because it does sound like a crisis with everything coming at us if we don't shift these paradigms of behavior and leadership. It will just simply exacerbate it. And you talked earlier about this concept of leaders' identity being tied up in some of this. And I think that is an impediment to some degree to being able to shift out of this mindset and adopt a different paradigm.
Yeah. I think it really does become an identity issue. And I think that's part of the resistance. There's a thing called change readiness and change resistance. And change readiness is often a cognitive state. Do I like this plan? Do I believe in the OKRs? Is the team all with me? I'm ready for this change. Change resistance takes place in the body. And there's that, this difference that we've said before. It seems like a threat, and that's where self-doubt and slow decisions comes from. I can't remember whether it's 72 or 73 or 74. It depends whether you're reading Harvard or PwC or whomever's report about why the majority of transformation programs fail. But what they've all begun to agree on is the reasons why they fail. And it is from this felt response, this change feels like a threat. Most change, ultimately, if you really boil it down, is either the change that happens to us or the change that we try to enact on the world. So there's conflict, legacy, you've just got to do something, my back's against the wall, the pain of not changing is greater than the change. Or there's teleological, which simply means planned change, the one that I'm going to set out into. And that is the form of uncertainty. Because sure, the plan looks good, but stepping into it brings with it that sensation. So the kind of school of thought that we've grown up with of what success means and what successful leadership looks like, it's incredibly hard to know what the middle ground would be, because not knowing simply isn't an answer either. So I was doing the analysis for a very well-known brand that everyone listening will recognize, and I was really proud to be getting to work with their 20 top leaders on this. The data was dead interesting for their leadership team. And when we have a full engagement where we get to do the digital cohort, the digital course that you've done, and we might have a couple of hundred, or we might even have a couple of thousand. It's a very scalable thing. We get this remarkable data set from that, and we know what people think about uncertainty, what they think the opportunity is, all this great stuff. And then we sit down with the leadership team and we do the in-person version of it, and they get to go through the fear, fog, stasis modules. But the really great experience is that they've also done their data set. So we can compare the two. So we'll say to the leaders, what's your biggest uncertainty? And chances are they'll give us their view of the world, and it'll be about the growth of the organization. And then we'll say, what do you think the big uncertainty of your team is? They'll say what they think it is, and then we'll reveal what it is. And all of a sudden we realize that we're working to two strategies. There is a and there's three questions we always ask at the end. What's the main uncertainty that you face? What is the opportunity in that uncertainty? And what is going to get in the way of that happening? And then something happened, because to the exact same 2/3, 1/3 ratio, something emerged. The people who opt for decisive/negative outcome, when asked to describe the greatest uncertainty, they can laser focus on what the uncertainty is in very few words. It's super clear and it's very tactical. And then when asked what the opportunity is, they are precise, they identify it clearly. And when they're asked what's going to get in the way, they name it clearly, frame it, and done. And you then look at the responses from the group who've optimized for positive and indecisive outcome. You ask them what the uncertainty is. They describe at a systems level the wide problem. Then you ask them what the opportunity is. And once again, systemic thinking shows its head. And then when asked what's going to get in the way, they identify themselves 2 times more often than the negative outcome decisive crew.
That's interesting.
And it is the consistent. So once we'd spotted that, we went back, ran it against all the data, and it is the consistent thing. So there is obviously a time when you need to be decisive, sure. And you need to be able to name what the problem is. And sometimes the problems are external. You need to be dead clear about that. But it can't always be that we're optimizing for commercial growth and the problem is the board.
Right.
But we also need to be able to recognize that the problem is interconnected and that we play a role as a barrier too. And we need both of those things. So what do we do? So we then began to look at this what we've started to reference as an uncertainty ready leader, because it would be a huge mistake to say one side is good, the other side is bad. That's one side is always appropriate, another side is sometimes. Both sides are appropriate at different times, and this is it. The new paradigm of leadership is to know when to come down on which side.
Right.
That's really what we're talking about, and to know that you have a preference for one and the other, and that self-awareness is something you can keep online even when your threat response has gone up. Or have you sunk down into one of the fear fog stasis modes? If so, which is the appropriate tool to bring yourselves back on. So to be uncertainty ready is to know this is a moment because the house is on fire, decisive at all costs. The threat is external and I need to operate. Or no, this is not the time for that. And so there are these 3 questions that we've begun to identify, these 3 lenses. And the first is altitude. Do you need to get higher up on this uncertainty? Are you looking at this through the lens of your Q test, the biases that you already have? Are you looking at it only through your own heuristics and experience? Can you gain some altitude? And the simplistic tool that we offer is what 3 diverse data points, and it could be advice, it could be a data set, it could be an external opinion, can you get on this uncertainty that will elevate your altitude on it? And the second is horizon. What is the widest horizon you can give yourself before this uncertainty truly becomes a problem? And it's not your threat response saying you need to have an answer by the end of this meeting or by the end of the day. Because and this is well known in psychology, right? If you set yourself a deadline, the feeling of pressure goes away. As long as you say, I'm going to make this decision by Friday, and you tell your team, all right, we don't have all the data points. Here's what we're going to do to get 3 new data points, and I'll make the decision tomorrow. But I'm not taking it in this meeting. That is actually a hugely decisive act. And that is not saying, I don't know.
Right.
So you establish the horizon and what can emerge, and you give space for emergence, because emergence is a strategy amongst uncertainty. New information will appear. The unexpected will occur. If you are available to it, you may get a lens that a closed-minded approach won't have. And then there's agency. What is my positive and proactive role in this? What is my power in this? And what is the best possible outcome that could emerge if I gain a new altitude and a new horizon? And then you were not defaulting to negativity bias, because that's what drives us, right? I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to look like an idiot. My board are going to say no. My house is going to, whatever. All of that threat comes in. So you now go, well, actually, the best thing possible is I might find a new answer in this that could lead us to a new product or a new audience share, or, God, I could just keep the stress off the team so they're not staying up all night. Whatever it is, I could be a hero. Your intrinsic, extrinsic, whatever the motivations are. Now you've got 3 new answers. Right, here's my data points. Here's my actual horizon. As long as I make a decision by then, nothing's going to go wrong. And here's what can happen. Just those 3 questions transform the pressure. You've made decisions. You've held space. Everything keeps moving, but you've created a scaffolding around a better decision amidst profound uncertainty.
I feel like that framework is so helpful, because some of it seems counterintuitive that by setting a deadline, it will actually feel like it's taken the pressure off.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, it is a decision, right? It's not the big decision, but it's a decision that helps to relieve some of that ambiguity in some ways that maybe benefits you and also makes your team feel better, which is a way of handling that notion of how do you feel like a trusted leader when sometimes the answer is, I don't know the whole answer.
And
Yeah,
for
I
a
love
mind like
that.
yours, I'd say it's not even a deadline. It's turning that decision into a hypothesis. So
Yeah.
this is the best decision I can make right now, and I'm
Yeah.
going to evaluate it as I go.
Yeah, it's how I do think a lot about decisions. I don't think about whether this is the exact right decision or wrong decision, but will this still feel like a good decision with the information that I had, say, 6 months or a year from now? And the outcome might not have been what I thought it would be, but if I still feel good about having how I made that decision, I feel like that's a good business outcome in many ways. Yeah. You have talked about a couple of leaders who you feel sort of both handle uncertainty well, exemplify some of these traits. They're Jacinda Ardern and Barack Obama. And I would love for you to just talk a little bit about what stands out for them.
I started looking at speeches and leaders, and I started synthesizing and analyzing, trying to find, who actually says, I don't know. And it was really interesting. I got the Penguin, a book of 21st century great speeches, and the only person who says, I don't know, with any consistency was Barack Obama. Like speech after speech after speech, the guy just stood up and said, I don't know. And then when I dug into it deeper and I did a survey about leaders with the cohorts who'd been through uncertainty experts, I asked which leader did people most respect, and Jacinda Ardern came out the top of that list, and for very similar reasons. And it's not just because they said they didn't know. They demonstrated a willingness to tolerate ambiguity that came across as bravery, intelligence, honesty. And, we're seeing this in the UK at the moment. We've just gone through a series of elections, and at one side you have a group who are really leaning into certainty, and they are making some very bold claims. It's a classic political playbook: force things into false binaries. This will all be okay, and these are the baddies.
Right.
And if your tolerance for uncertainty is low, it's shown in numerous political studies that we're more likely to buy into false binaries, conspiracy theories, and even extremist tendencies. And then there's a group of people who've held the political center for a long, long time, and they've fallen to the wayside because they look like they can't make a decision. So you see this thing that I'm pointing to, right? We're not in a moment in time where we can just not make up our minds, and I'm not advocating that at all.
Right.
But being able to say, this is what's important, this is what we do know, and this is what we don't know, and this is what I'm going to do about it, has a nuance to it that meets the moment. And the thoughtful recognize that this is a nuanced moment. And if we oversimplify our responses, we do so at the risk of the answers that we might discover. And our willingness to stand on the edge of something that's truly new and not reach for what we've already known is really the strength that's going to define us. To hold and find something truly new and allow it to emerge whilst we still don't understand it, and not be scared of it. That's surely part of what leadership in this forefront of the kind of volume of change that we're truly going through means.
I want to talk a little bit about the unlikely experts. So it's not surprising that we look to folks like Barack Obama, Jacinda Ardern, like CEOs. These are folks who are often written up as role models, or whose behaviors are ones that we look to mimic or at least understand. But in the online course that you have the series, and you talked about them, a series of unlikely experts. You talked about gangland bosses, recovering addicts, hostages. Why did you choose those voices specifically?
I was volunteering at the time because I didn't have much work, and the people I was volunteering with from my background in social enterprise were very often from marginalized communities who were entrepreneurs. And as I mentored them, I actually discovered a level of resilience, good humor. Actually, the humor really stuck with me because it's an aspect of resilience. And if I worked with young people who were refugees and in gangs, so I widened the pool, and homelessness and substance misuse came into it. And what I began to see was a very clear set of patterns. And the UK population at the time, as I looked into it, I'm sure would be mirrored in the US and much of Western Europe, in the percentage of whom were veterans, in the percentage of whom had been homeless, in the percentage of who lived on the poverty line, in the percentage of whom were single parents. And what occurred to me was that the level of uncertainty that people in that experience have to navigate to get to the end of the week to pay the bills, even though it's possibly reductive and a microcosm, is a set of skills that aren't on display around me. They are a more dynamic, responsive skill set where truth is defined by values, not brittle rules that are in a moment of, what's it called, when things are going through a liminal state of not knowing and not reaching for the rigidity or the falsity of what's being proposed, but being able to handle that something's moving and morphing. That truth, that difficult honesty that we're working something out, and then that be disregarded as lesser or informal, to me was significant and advanced and an intelligent dynamic response. And so dug into it and I created a bit of a framework. So my first uncertainty experts, they had to have had approximately 10 years living in the extremes of uncertainty, because I'd read that that would be long enough to neurologically rewire someone. Like you would actually begin to, that hypervigilance for survival would begin to be a neuroplasticity would begin to occur, and you'd have a new way of working things out. And they had to have been successful, and I say that in inverted commas, because to be a successful drug dealer or smuggler or a refugee is not success in a classic sense, but they had survived, let's say,
Right.
and they demonstrated the tenacity to get through that, and via the metrics of whatever that world was. And then they'd used the same skills, so that we're not just talking about survivor bias, to become success in a mainstream setting that we could recognize too. So there's a duality to their success. And once I had them, we went to the decision-making uncertainty lab, showed the interviews, and they began to help us synthesize this process through fear, fog, and stasis. And they looked for the tools that navigated the fear, so tools of emotional regulation that these guys all demonstrated that they had, chiefly things like interoception, things that are, that start the book, things that bring us all back to a place of homeostasis and an ability to make decisions again. And secondly was around meta-awareness, an ability to think about your thoughts and thought processes, to not be hijacked by worry loops, and to maintain the calm so that uncertainty doesn't become just a place of doubt, but a place of discovery. And weirdly, that point about neuroplasticity is very true. There are two states that studies show that drive neuroplasticity, even in later life. And one is psilocybin, magic mushrooms, that really gets the synapses going, but not many executives have time for on a day-to-day basis. And then uncertainty, trying to reconcile your way around an unsolved challenge. And then that third state of how do you navigate through the stuckness of uncertainty. And we explored ideas of embodied cognition, particularly there, like intuition, gut instinct. How do you bring that inner sense of navigation online? And so my interviews had to correlate with that model, and that 9 stories came out and they met the criteria. So we believed we had a robust set, and then they are just the stimulus. So they're not meant to be teachers. They are stimulus. We listen to their stories. They're good and they're unusual, and it's not another bloody Elon Musk case study. So there's a different story of innovation, but the true teaching, you meet the unusual characters, then you meet Catherine, who explains the science, what's going on neurobiologically for you when you enter uncertainty, and the true teaching comes from the reflections. And we've tested this. So the course that you saw at UCL, they pieced it apart. We measured one where we just gave people the science tools, and that was cool and interesting. People appreciate the tools. We did one where we just had the stories, and people were inspired. We did some with stories and the science. Great. When you put in the reflections, that's when it works. There's a question that we ask in the course: what's the greatest adversity that you're proudest to have faced? And it's designed to put out the paradox of uncertainty, and that the adversity is a strong word and pride is a strong word. And by identifying the greatest adversity that you're proudest of, and in something like, I think it's 15,000 people that have completed the online version, most of the questions are optional. That question has never not been answered. Human beings have seen the hardest of things. And people, it's anonymous, and people report the dysmorphia and the depression and the divorce and the downright difficulties of life. And what it shows you is that we all will be taken to our knees by life, and we all will be again. And yet we all get back up, and given enough time and enough tools and enough love, you recognize the strength it gave us. And that is like the fulcrum of all of this. And yet the sad truth is that the old Nietzsche saying, life's rich school of war, whatever doesn't kill us will make us stronger, is true to most of us retrospectively. And that's probably what Uncertainty Experts does, is makes that true in a forward-looking
way.
Well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is amazing both how much I think our uncertainty tolerance is shaped by those prior experiences, but also how parallel we are as humans. Like there are reasons that those stories really felt like parables of the human condition to me. And I could see myself in them, not because I've been a gang leader, but because I could imagine those moments where I felt similar types of sensations of insecurity or not knowing. That's why I found those stories so helpful, actually. Because there is a moment where you think like, oh, okay, I've survived things and I can do anything. There's a moment where that goes off for you in your head sometimes, and that's a helpful feeling to have.
Yeah, they were tough moral and editorial choices, and we were very lucky. The choice of those stories, so they weren't misleading and they weren't over. You needed to have a story that our memory will latch onto, and that charming gangster gave me some brilliant advice. And next time I go into a difficult situation, I'm remembering what he said. Like there's a way that our memory attaches to stories and makes us think of our own experience. So they were tough editorial choices to make, but you are one of thousands of people who've said the same. Like it's through those stories and then the science and the reflection that we caught a glimpse of ourselves and reminded ourselves what we're capable of. And that is the point of those parables.
All right. So, Sam, we always like to close our episodes with a bit of a lightning round. There's 7 questions, way for the audience to get to know a little bit more about our guests. Okay. What book, film, or article or podcast would you recommend to our listeners?
I've just finished reading The Walking Dead by Robert Kirkman, which the very famous TV series was based on. It is the greatest graphic novel of all time, and it's the best story of survival and love and what it means to be a human. You might not be into graphic novels, you might think they're childish or comic books, but it's the most epic story of gripping. So it's a New York Times bestseller. It's just what an amazing corpus, a body of work. And I was gripped from end to end. And like all good books, when you finish them, you miss the characters. And I had no idea. I'm not into zombie movies or anything like that. And it's just the best graphic novel there is.
Amazing. So, who's a thinker or leader that you look up to?
A thinker or leader that I look up to is my wife, Catherine Templar Lewis. She's a neuroscientist. She runs a neuroaesthetics laboratory. I was introduced to her at the beginning of this journey where I was looking for a scientist to put the uncertainty behind this, and we fell in love at our very first Zoom call. We now have a son called Elvis, and we live and work together, and I shall be with her until we're sitting on our deck chairs at the end of the universe. And she has taught me to feel. I thought I was always, to use the a rather brilliant Ken Robinson's line, that our body's just a vehicle to get our brain to the next meeting, and the truth of how we navigate the world and do our best is in our bodies. And that's how I learned what neuroscience and love really means.
That is lovely. What is a skill that you're working on?
I am working on a skill of breaking conformity to the rigid ideas of gender stereotypes. I don't think there's a story in the news that doesn't have that rigidity to it, and typically as a bad character. And I've developed a program which allows men specifically who have been working on it to break out of something known as the man box, where the idea is that vulnerability is weakness and that strength is dominance. And in the early testing that we've done, it could well be the most effective intervention of its type. And what it involves is men getting their nails done. And so over the next 3 years in the UK, I'm going to get 350,000 men to get their nails painted and go about a week of their lives and record what it means. And from what we've seen so far, it has a huge impact on their understanding of selfhood and identity, and makes those notions of rigid adherence to masculinity norms somewhat more fluid, which has a profoundly positive effect on their levels of empathy, allyship, inclusivity, and understanding of others and of themselves.
What is a skill you're proud of?
Reading. I think a lot about attention, and I think a lot about phones, and I have soon to be teenage children, and the impact of our attention crisis. And it can't just be put your phones in the drawers and don't have your phones in your bedrooms. And I spent 3 months without a phone, without a smartphone last year. It was hell on earth. So I don't think it's getting rid of them. But I think if you want to hold on to your brain, if you want to hold on to your ability to thought, I think read.
What's a mistake you've learned from?
I think I didn't think that I deserved an awful lot of stuff. I think I suffered from very low self-esteem and self-worth, and not believing that I was entitled to enjoy myself or find love or happiness. And I'm just coming to terms with the fact that my life is really wonderful. I mean, unfortunately, at the point that it seems the world is about to fall apart, so that's a shame. Nonetheless, internally, I feel a sense of happiness and safety and love that I've never known, and I'm really glad that I've finally realized that.
What's a philosophy you live by?
The philosophy I live by is that the sign of true success in life is your ability to have a nap.
I'm bad at that. What advice would you give to your younger self?
The advice I would give to my younger self is do it all, but more. Do it all, just do it all again. Do it all. I think it's something I learned from Catherine. You don't regret the things you've done, you regret the things you haven't done.
Mm,
And that is, for sure the truth.
that is lovely, actually. I think that's great advice for all of us. I'll quickly reflect on some takeaways from this conversation. Uncertainty is not actually the problem. Certainty theater is. 65% of leaders would rather look decisive and get it wrong than look uncertain and get it right. It's not a personality flaw. It's what organizations have trained us to do to some degree. And the 35% who resist that are already in the building. They are people who are ready to behave different. But you talked about those 3 questions around altitude, horizon, and agency. Those are learnable, and those are ways that we can teach our teams to think through a problem, even if they don't know the answer. And for many leaders, making that shift isn't a behavior change, it's an identity change. We have to get comfortable with thinking about ourselves as leaders from a different vantage point. Sam, can you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and Catherine and the Uncertainty Toolkit?
Yes, of course. Me and Catherine can be found at uncertaintyexperts.com. I'm the only Sam Conniff there is. There's a Samantha Conniff I've discovered recently. We're friends now on LinkedIn. And Catherine is the only Catherine Templar Lewis because she got that name for her equity card because as well as a neuroscientist, she was also an actress. So we're easy to find. We're also a company called MediaZoo who bought Uncertainty Experts last year. And we now have this global company backing us up who are education learning specialists. So all these tools that I'm talking about with such passion and enthusiasm are now being deployed at scale around the world. And you will find us on our mutual adventures over the next couple of years. Catherine is studying and exploring emotions and how they can be unlocked to greater human impact. And I'll be getting men getting their nails done the world over and seeing what we can do about some of the messes that we find ourselves in.
Excellent. Sam, thanks so much for joining us today on Creative Confidence. I think this might make some of our listeners uncomfortable, but in exactly the right way.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed all of our conversations. We should have recorded them all. We could have had our own series, but this has certainly been the best.
Maybe we'll do another one. I think it could be a lot of fun.
Thank you all. Thank you for listening.